So hello everyone, good evening. I'm Fiona Jenkins. I'm the convener of the Gender Institute at ANU, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, as are many of us joining the seminar from Canberra. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which others of you may be working today. And I'd like to extend our respect to the elders and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating today. Now, this is the third seminar in a series that's been co-sponsored by the Gender Institute and Maternal Health Matters, and we're very proud to have been involved with this really interesting series, which has been exploring the impact of maternity on women's well-being and the transition to parenting. And this evening, I think we're going to hear some really fascinating perspectives on this question, really opening up the whole space, I think, by drawing on the resources of art to think about the extraordinary and wonderful challenges of motherhood. And I realize as I speak that is, of course, Mother's Day on Sunday. And what better way to lead into that day than with some thoughtful reflections on this whole area of life, of what becoming a mother means and how it can be experienced and how it can indeed be better supported. Let me just share a couple of words about the Gender Institute. The Gender Institute was set up at ANU to connect gender and sexuality researchers right across ANU, and indeed to join that community of researchers with the wider community, very much as this seminar does. And if you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, strongly recommend it. It comes out every fortnight. You can have a look at our website. It's easy to find, ANU Gender Institute. And you can subscribe to the newsletter there. We've been particularly pleased to work with Maternal Health Matters and especially with Dr. Joan Garvin, who's going to take over from me in a moment, as well as Dr. Julie Smith, who's been a long-term huge member of the Gender Institute, very productive in the space of looking at a range of issues related to motherhood, particularly breastfeeding.
So welcome everyone who's joining our session, Maternity and Art. It's broadening out the spectrum of the topics that we can talk about when we talk about maternity. It's there's the humanities have a lot to say about maternity, all from literature to philosophy to all sorts of sub-sociology, and so art is one dimension of that, which I think really pleased to be having this opportunity. So one of the things I wanted to start with is the guiding principle for Maternal Health Matters, which is respectful maternity care. And in my engagement with Maternal Health Matters, I've been introduced to the spectrum of what that means, respectful maternity care, which is the universal rights of childbearing women. And so mothering is an issue of social justice and women's human rights. And there's a charter for respectful maternity care, which includes all kinds of dimensions of the experience, including the human rights in language and key programs relevant to maternity care, providing a basis for holding the maternal care system and communities accountable for these rights. And that's part of our reason for being, is that wider perspective on what it means to birth, pregnancy and birth and becoming a mother. Bianca combines community sector and academic experience to address social justice issues. She has a diploma in art therapy, and her PhD explored birthing parents' experience of pregnancy as mediated through art. She is currently the Senior Project Officer at Families Australia, where she provides advice to government and the community sector on national policy issues related to gender and family. And she's currently a visiting fellow at the ANU. So, Bianca, I'll hand over to you. I'll just...
Hi, everyone. I'll just see if I can share my screen. I'm screen sharing now, is that right?
Yeah.
It says I am screen sharing, so that's great. Yes, so I just wanted to start by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands, traditional lands, we meet today, and to pay respects to elders past, present and future. And I would like to acknowledge any First Nations people here tonight. I'd also like to particularly acknowledge Kamilaroi elder Auntie Paula Duncan, Ngunnawal Ngambri elder Auntie Matilda House, former Beyond Empathy CEO Kim McConville, and lead artist and Jo Davidson from Beyond Empathy. I'd also like to acknowledge the women from the Kamilaroi community who partnered on the project I'll be showing tonight. I was humbled to be given the chance to work with these women and be able to share our combined stories that we worked on tonight. So tonight I'm going to mainly explore everyday women's experience of art and pregnancy, sometimes with the help of a professional artist. And this is a topic I explored in my PhD thesis. But first I'll share some of my background stories about what inspired me to take on the project. So prior to having children, I was living in Paris, France, and one day I was going to lunch with a group of Australian women, and a new mother with a baby was there, and she shared her recent and very traumatic, highly medicalised birthing experience. And I think her trauma was really compounded by the fact that she was giving birth in a foreign country where she didn't speak the language and she was away from her family. And she was still clearly healing mentally and physically from the experience. Now, the women listening could have just written her story off as an unfortunate one-off experience, but they didn't. It was fortunate that some women in the group were older and part of the second wave feminist movement of the 60s and the 70s. As you're likely aware, central to the movement was the phrase, "the personal is political." And while the meaning has changed over time, in its original sense, the slogan highlights the interconnectedness between personal experiences and broader social and political structures. Previously, issues like sex, childcare, pregnancy, and domesticity were seen as private matters. However, the personal is political asserts that these personal issues are inherently political and they require intervention for meaningful change. So the women at the lunch immediately called out the fact that this terrible birth experience was not a one-off, but it was actually symptomatic of the highly medicalised and not at all women-centred birthing system in France at that time. And I remember thinking, if this can happen in a rich Western country to middle-class women, what must it be like for women the world over? So I made a mental note not to get pregnant, especially not in France. But then I found out I was, and I felt trapped and scared. My mother had recently died. The rest of my family and best friends were 17,000 kilometres away. So I was really grateful for that woman sharing her story, because if she didn't, the other women may never have rallied to get round her. And I might not have thought to sort out a private midwife who listened, who explained, who asked permission and treated me with respect. And actually, it was a lot cheaper than getting an obstetrician. So sharing stories matter. Sharing stories matters. And this is 20 years ago that I'm talking about. And it's only now that we're seeing birth trauma hitting the headlines here in Australia. So it has taken a long time. And we need to recognise that this change didn't come about overnight, but it came through mothers and midwives and doulas and advocates and friends speaking out. So as I said, sharing stories matters, and it has the power to change the world for the better. But what does sharing stories have to do with art? Well, people share stories in different ways. Art can be a way of processing thoughts and feelings about pregnancy and birthing, and it can also be a way of documenting a journey. And when art is shared, it can be a form of storytelling. A book I and many women have read during pregnancy was the 1998 LeMay's bestseller, Birthing from Within, which received praise from midwives for being the first pregnancy guide to use art therapy techniques to psychologically prepare women for birth and to navigate the holistic aspects of birthing. The book included many therapeutic art exercises. And one of the activities in the book, which I would have liked to have done, was create a pregnancy belly cast. That is a 3-dimensional plaster mold of the pregnant torso. But I never made a belly cast because it just seemed too hard to do by myself. And while I had friends in Paris, I didn't know them well enough to ask them to help me. So I just felt really alone. As my children grew, pregnancy belly casting continued to appear in contemporary birth preparation manuals, such as Sacred Pregnancy, which suggests creating a belly cast is an example of a rite of passage which marks the transition from pregnancy to birthing. In 2015, doula Stephanie Sorensen wrote a memoir about working with racially and ethnically diverse women and birthing people, often incorporating belly casts into her practice to assist nervous mothers to relax and bond with their unborn child. In this way, belly casts may shape and mould pregnant women and birthing people's experience and ease the transition between pregnancy and birth. So with these ideas swirling around in my head, in 2015, I started a PhD. The broad aims of my research were to explore how artists, celebrities, and everyday women mediate their complex feelings about pregnancy through the practice of pregnancy belly casting. And secondly, to explore the way in which pregnancy belly casts may be used as a means of increasing empathy and understanding between diverse groups of women and or birthing parents. My thesis uncovered a rich genealogy of pregnancy belly casting, and I argued that it had been an overlooked but important feminist practice since at least the 1960s to present. And I was really surprised to find 8 different case studies from Denmark to the USA to the UK, Australia, and Papua New Guinea. However, of all the examples of pregnancy belly casting I explored in my thesis, I've decided to share today an Aboriginal Australian belly casting program called Mumbili Sea of Bellies. In 2004, the Moree Base Hospital needed to find a way to engage pregnant teenage Aboriginal women with healthcare services, or girls, I should say, if they're teenagers. And this was because often the first times the hospitals would see these women is when the young mother was about to be giving birth. So in order to improve outcomes for mothers and babies, they needed to provide support earlier. The hospital engaged Kim McConville, who was the CEO of Beyond Empathy, and Kim suggested that pregnant Aboriginal girls or women might like to have a pregnancy belly cast made while the midwife engages with them. While Kim reports that the hospital thought she was crazy, they decided to give it a go anyway. The belly cast would act as an incentive for the mums to come in, and as the process takes time, the midwives and medical staff then have time to talk to the mother. And the cast is then removed, but it's not finished, so the mother has to come back on another day. So the cast is then filled with plaster and it's dried and it's chiseled to create a sculpture. And later an elder paints the cast with designs requested by the mother. So here is Kamilaroi elder Auntie Paula Duncan painting a belly cast as the mother has to return to pick up the belly cast. She becomes engaged with a playgroup. So she becomes connected to midwives, elders and culture. Can everyone see my slides still? Can you still see the slide pictures? Yep, great. While young mothers may feel at the fringe of society, Aboriginal belly casts, where elders inscribe images on the pregnant women's bodies, may be a means, to paraphrase Maternal Robinson, of replacing disparaging images of themselves with their own representations. So many Aboriginal mothers, grandmothers and community peaks, such as Kelly Briggs, Grandmas Against Removals and SNAKE, the National Voice for Our Children, have worked to raise public salience about issues affecting Aboriginal mothers, such as the high rate of Aboriginal children continuing to be removed from their parents. So the latest Family Matters report states that there are over 22,000 First Nation kids in out-of-home care. So I think for a visual, I think I heard Catherine Little recently say, if you picture the population of Alice Springs, it's almost as many people, but with all of the children who are Aboriginal who are in out-of-home care, that's how many people. Maternal Robinson has argued that radical feminism's implicit definition of white motherhood as the norm has historically, and I emphasise historically, meant that white feminists had simply ignored Indigenous women's experiences of child removal. And Jackie Huggins argues that Aboriginal and non-Indigenous women's stances on fertility have traditionally been almost polar opposites. She writes, where white women's demand to control their fertility were related to contraception and abortion, Aboriginal women were subject to unwanted sterilisation and continued struggle against the loss of their children to interventionist welfare agencies. From the perspective of a practical reconciliation, the Sea of Bellies preempted the Closing the Gap campaign, which started in 2008 with the aim of closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians on life expectancy, educational achievement and employment opportunities. At the time of the Moobly program, it started back in 2004, Indigenous Australians were twice as likely to die in association with pregnancy and childbirth as other Australian women. I think I read the statistic 2 to 3 times. I know there'll be some midwives here who'll give me the latest statistic, but I think that was the statistic at that time. Indigenous Australian women at that time were also 2 to 3 times more likely to have a low birth weight infant, and babies with a low birth weight are much more likely to have chronic health problems in adult life. Now, to the extent that the women engaging with the Moobly program gave them increased access to maternal health staff, it's an example of a practical reconciliation of trying to then get that medical help earlier and to ensure better birth outcomes for everyone. And indeed, the Moobly Sea of Bellies program received a number of health awards. Now, the CEO of Kim McConville of Beyond Empathy said she had envisaged a sea of bellies for reconciliation. I don't know if you know the sea of hands, but that was sort of her vision. And this led me to ponder if the sea of bellies could also be used as an emblem for a symbolic women's representation. So it's a practical reconciliation, but what about a people's symbolic reconciliation? So both Sutton and Dodson have articulated the need for a reconciliation led by everyday people, but they didn't really comment on the role of gender in the reconciliation process. And after much searching, I found that there was actually some work towards a women-centred people's reconciliation that was undertaken in the 1990s by groups such as the Women's Reconciliation Network. Similarly, in 2008, Aberdeen and Matthews wrote on the importance of women's circles for increasing understanding between Indigenous and other Australian women. Yet currently there's no evidence of any such women's circles being held, and there's little further academic comment on the phenomena. This is disappointing because, as Kutcher and Milroy argue, it is important that we hear the voices of Aboriginal mothers telling their own stories, not simply to give voice to Aboriginal mothers, women, but also because we actually may find they reveal a richer model of motherhood for all. So in the spirit of storytelling, I worked with the Kamilaroi women to find ways of sharing stories. The women wanted to bring Moobly and their project, which they're very proud of, to the attention of new audiences. But we also wanted to create an environment where the Kamilaroi women were not there just to share their culture, but the people listening would also have to share their story too. By considering how creating a belly cast literally recasts bodies and reinscribes bodies anew, we thought about how they may afford a space for new interactions not previously possible. Because the belly cast is quite literally a prosthesis, I drew upon Landsberg's prosthetic memory as a means through which people, usually separated by geographic distance, may take on the memory of others. So we decided to hold a memory workshop, which we drew upon a feminist qualitative approach inspired by Meredith Nash's work. And we also looked at a qualitative yarning approach to sort of chatting and yarning, which was inspired by the work of Moore and Riley. And the work was also more broadly, loosely inspired by the work of Brianna Alcala. So we sort of put a number of methodologies together to create this workshop. To explore this idea, 4 Kamilaroi women from Moree and Beyond Empathy lead artist Jo Davidson visited Canberra between the 6th 12th and 16th of October in 2017. They were welcomed to country by Auntie Matilda House on the Friday. On Sunday, they met with women from the ACT region who had also made belly casts, and they participated in a memory workshop where they shared their belly cast stories. So the women actually drove in a bus because we worked out how were they going to get here, and we had a lot of ideas, but they actually decided to drive themselves. Amazing women, almost, over 700 kilometres each way. So at the outset of this memory workshop or belly workshop, Auntie Matilda House talked about her family history and her work with the Stolen Generations Council, New South Wales and ACT. Matilda explained how she thought the belly art was important to the stolen generations. She said, when they were having their babies, it was a trauma because that belly represented a generation. And now that generation is gone. And that's what that belly art should be looking at as well. And she went on to say, so doing belly art like this is something that will go on forever through the generations because no one understands what it's all about. And I think it's a wonderful gift. So when Matilda says no one understands what it's all about, she seems to suggest that the belly casting process itself is a way of working through cultural trauma and trying to make sense of the past. Matilda then encouraged the women to share their stories. The Kamilaroi women introduced themselves. Sabby explained that her belly cast had a goanna on it, which is a totem for her. Other Kamilaroi women had brought up belly casts with them from Moree, which belonged to women who couldn't make it to Canberra, and in doing so, they represented their community. Gemma, for example, told a hilarious story about the butterfly belly cast, which flits from one place to another, and no one can find it, and then how it flew down to Canberra. And the Canberra women also introduced themselves and their belly casts. It was a very respectful process with all the women engaging in each other's stories. Some of the themes which came up in the discussion were body image. So some of the Kamilaroi women shared that they had called stretch marks tribal marks, which the Canberra women thought they much preferred. They talked about connection to place. So two of the ACT region women explained their deep connections to place and how they were actually incorporated on their belly cast designs. So the picture there, the woman had Lily Pilly, the place, represented on her design through the Lily Pilly flower on there, which is a place of significance to her. A few of the women had experienced traumatic experiences during pregnancy. One woman's mother was gravely ill and another two had serious health concerns for their unborn child. So this is, to use a term from Lauren Bellant, the crisis ordinariness of pregnancy, which perhaps makes discussions around pregnancy lead more readily to empathy for broader cultural trauma. Women also discussed the technical aspects of making a belly cast, and the Canberra women were really in awe of the Mumbley program's expertise in the practice of belly casting. And there really was that sense of, as Kutcher and Milrose suggested, Aboriginal women providing a richer experience of motherhood for all. And there were also conversations about cultural differences, including family involvement in pregnancy and birthing. One of the Kamilaroi women, for example, explained how the elders wouldn't touch the belly cast without the mother's permission. One of the Canberra region women observed, I really like what you were saying about the aunties and the elder women who wouldn't touch the belly casts at all. And I think that's really respectful. And it shows that love and respect for the mother and the baby together. That's really special. I think it's really nice. A lot of women don't have that. So these conversations highlight the Canberra women's awe for the Kamilaroi women's experience in expertise in pregnancy belly casting. It also reveals their admiration for the elders' involvement in the program as providing a level of respect for the Kamilaroi mothers, which many mothers do not receive. Such statements make manifest Kutcher and Milroy's suggestion that Aboriginal mothers' stories may demonstrate an inclusive and supportive model of mothering, a model which might even be preferable to the isolating and lonely experience that the white mainstream model of mothering can so often produce. The Kamilaroi women also expressed appreciation for the Canberra women's process. At one stage, Rachel, in what seemed a literal example of prosthetic memory, wore Holly's belly cast, and she reflected, "It's beautiful how all these bellies got stories too." I guess normally people knew that women knew they had their program, but I don't think they realised there were other women who made belly casts too, and that they also had the stories. Prior to the workshop, we'd prepared a large wire frame into which the workshop participants wove colourful yarn, which had actually been finger knitted by the Moobly women some months ago. And it was used to create a lasting symbol of the yarns exchanged that day. It served as an example of what Anne Savekovich calls crafting's redefinition of what counts as politics to include sensory interactions with highly tactile spaces and with other people, or in other words, feelings. So the memory workshop helped to understand how everyday women relate through pregnancy belly casts, or through art, if you want it to be more broad. And it showed that there is a keen interest to discuss issues pertaining to pregnancy and motherhood between First Nations and other women. And that, I think, if discussions are framed in terms of acknowledging stolen generations and reconciliation, there is a potential to engage people in a way which makes them consider taking further action. One of the women was asking Matilda how to get involved with Aboriginal politics, for example. So some of the Canberra women had belly casts which actually needed to be repaired. So Aunt Jo and the Kamilaroi women taught the ACT region women how to fortify their casts with plaster. And this act was deeply symbolic because a critique of closing the gap is that it implicitly holds non-Indigenous Australians as a standard up to which First Nations Australians have to be brought up to. But although this was only occurring at a crafting and a symbolic level, the belly repair clinic kind of showed the complete opposite of bringing the non-Indigenous women up to the standard of the First Nations women. So such symbolic actions, I think, assist in rewriting existing paradigms of advantage and disadvantage. At the end of the day, everyone shared a lunch which had been prepared by the Kamilaroi women. And as if to summarise the concept of a people's reconciliation, Auntie Matilda House said, "Everyone is doing their bit, just like all of us being there together and sitting around there and having those yarns, those belly yarns. You know, so it is out there. People get disappointed because they're like, oh, there wasn't much. But there was, because you're going to go somewhere and have a good yarn with people too." As mentioned earlier, this project was done some time ago now, but I think there's still so much work, obviously, to do on closing the gap, on child removal, on reconciliation, all of those issues. So I think the messages of the workshop of really listening and sharing are more important than ever. So to go back to the point I started with, sharing stories matters. Sharing pregnancy and birthing stories matter. And they can be shared in many ways, not only with our voices, but also through art. And this sharing can lead to new understandings and social change, both in the medical system and within broader society. But don't take it from me. Let's instead end with the words of Auntie Matilda House. There's always a story in that belly art. In that belly yarn, there is always a story. And there are so many stories that you couldn't keep track of all the stories because there are so many. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. That was fabulous. Okay, so just finishing off, I just wanted to make a few comments about Maternal Health Matters. If you go to the homepage, there's our vision and position statements on all kinds of things. There's a maternity toolkit, a blog, and access to recordings of the earlier events. So just have a look at Maternal Health Matters. And just on respectful maternity care, which I've been educated about, is it includes that human rights approach that I talked about earlier, which means you know, issues to do with physical abuse, non-consensual clinical care, non-confidential care, non-dignified care, and that came out in that inquiry about trauma, discrimination based on specific patients' attributes, and discrimination is a thing that happens, unfortunately, and way too often. Abandonment or denial of care, and detention in facilities. That's so respectful care has a very wide brief. And I think in some ways, you know, the medicalisation of care has cheated us of this humanities and the human experience of pregnancy and birth and beyond, that, you know, is so much a feature of what women are especially reflecting on in their work.